You know, when it comes to the Vietnam War, it's usually seen as a pretty big L here in America for us. We failed, to put it nicely, and it really is just something that's, yeah, not a lot of Americans that I can think of are very proud of to talk about. And again, I think this was during the time, obviously, of the Cold War, where the US was trying to combat communism, and the Soviet Union and the USA were basically playing chess with multiple different countries, battling with ideologies of communism and capitalism. And yeah, Vietnam was one of them, much like the Korean War and so on and so forth. And I learned about a lot of this back in my sophomore year of high school. In one of my English classes, we had to read a novel called The Things They Carried, which is a novel about, the Vietnam War and the effects that US soldiers had to. And this war is very famous in terms of how it affected veterans and how veterans were really not well after. I mean, granted, at the time, a lot of Americans, even at the time, kind of wanted the war to end. You'll see famous videos of, American citizens protesting the war, wanting it to end. And even when veterans got back, a lot of them were not treated as well. Granted, veterans not being treated well wasn't exclusive to this, but it is. I feel like it's something that does get talked a lot about in terms of the effects and just the PTSD, because again, fighting the guerrilla wars and stuff from the Vietnam War definitely was a very interesting, I feel like it had a very interesting effect, and I think it definitely helped, like, kind of bring down America a peg or two, because again, we think of like World War II, yeah, America, we rocked and we were awesome, and then kind of like, I feel like the Vietnam War might have been one of the major ones after that time that kind of showed, oh yeah, America, we're not completely unstoppable in some respects. So yeah, I really enjoyed that novel, by the way, the things they carried, and I remember being very like, yeah, a lot of these guys got really like screwed up. I think it gave a really good account of PTSD and a really good, like, yeah, we should ought to really take these things seriously, because again, I feel like, I mean, all veterans from all wars, I think, suffer from it, definitely. And not to say any war, anyone walks out completely alright, but there's just something about this war, like, man, like, I gotta read that book again, but it's hard at times. It was really difficult. But yeah, that's kind of like, I wanted to talk about, like, some of my own experiences learning about it. And yeah, kind of how it's seen overall, pretty big L on America, to put it nicely. I haven't heard anyone talk about this war as something to be proud of. And, again, I've given you a lot of an American perspective, but today we're watching a video from the Armchair Historian. This one is called Vietnam War from the Vietnamese Perspective. So this will be very interesting. I do like these videos where we get insight into the other side, because I'm an American. I'm from America. We're taught this war from an American perspective, obviously. It'll be really interesting. I want to get the full picture of things, though, and kind of look at the other side of the curtain, as it were, and really see, well, what did the Vietnamese think of all this? Like, how did they feel? And, overall, yeah, I'm really looking forward to that, because we've seen a few of the Armchair Historian's videos, and they're very well done. He's a really great YouTuber, so I do trust him to, like, break this down, and hopefully give me a much better view of this conflict. So, yeah, before I get started, if you want to watch the original video without my yapping, the link to this video is down in the description down below. And wait a second. Yeah, and if you want to help support my channel in any way, shape, or form, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and maybe consider being like a YouTube Patreon member. It would really help me out a lot. Thank you. Now, with that said, and now without any further ado, let's get to it. Let us find out from the Armchair Historian about the Vietnam War from the North Vietnamese perspective. I forgot to emphasize the North earlier.
I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Mentioning the Vietnam War is one of the fastest ways to spark controversy in any military history community. Opinions will rage back and forth about whether or not the USA was justified in its intervention, what mistakes it made, and if America really ever had a chance of victory. But while topics such as these are very common, what is much less talked about is the perspective of the Vietnamese people during the conflict, their motivations, the agenda of their leaders, and how they endured nearly 20 years of bloody, vicious guerrilla warfare. This video will seek to explain their side of the story, as well as provide context for the stubborn spirit of resistance that enabled Vietnam to hold out against the American juggernaut despite all efforts to beat them into submission. Supporting our sponsors is to understand the attitude of the Vietnamese during the war, one must first be aware of Vietnam's history of occupation and exploitation by foreign powers. First, there was China, which spent 1,000 years trying to absorb the nation through both conquest and cultural assimilation. However, by the 19th century, China was undergoing its own negative experiences with colonialism, as powerful European empires began expanding into Asia and destroying the old status quo. With Chinese influence on the wane, it seemed as if Vietnam might have a chance to stand on its own, but a small squadron of French warships would promptly crush those hopes. Unable to resist this technologically superior foe, the Nguyen imperial dynasty ruling Vietnam at the time quickly capitulated, and by 1884 most of Vietnam had become part of the greater colonial union of French Indochina. With the Nguyen court reduced to a puppet administration, colonial governors operated with virtually no oversight from the French state, and were allowed to use any and all means at their disposal to suppress any hint of native resistance. Often this extended to the point of criminalizing the mere act of identifying oneself as Vietnamese. Trapped in a thoroughly miserable existence, the Vietnamese peasants were desperate for a savior, any savior. But after decades
Sorry, I was reading this thing. Holy crap.
of failed revolts and horrific reprisals, the iron grip of colonialism remained as strong as ever. Yet, unbeknownst to the peasantry, the seeds of a new revolution were already being sown, not in the plantations or even in the courts of the Nguyen bureaucracy, but in the coffee houses of Paris, where the few Vietnamese lucky enough to scrape together enough money to afford a Western education were debating the merits of a strange, radical new ideology known as communism. Unlike any political ideology at the time, communism promised freedom and equality for those laboring under the yoke of capitalistic imperialism, and so spread like wildfire from the moment it was introduced from overseas, becoming Vietnam's dominant underground political movement by the early 1930s. Central to the communist movement in Vietnam was the unassuming son of a disgraced bureaucrat called Nguyen Sinh Quong, or as he is more commonly known, Ho Chi Minh. After leaving Vietnam sometime in the 1910s, Ho Chi Minh drifted around Europe, visiting both the United States and possibly Britain. As early as 1918, he was a dedicated anti-imperialist, joining the group of Vietnamese patriots which petitioned the French government for independence during the Treaty of Versailles. In 1920, he was one of the many communists avidly following the progress of Vladimir Lenin's October Revolution in Russia, the success of which proved beyond any doubt that the imperialist system could be overthrown through force of arms. Inspired by Lenin's success.
Yeah, Karl Marx, man. You ever think Karl Marx knew that his ideas were gonna gain such rapid, like, growth? Because I feel like the 20th century just saw this spike in communism and, went on to become, like, a major, I guess, like, ideology in the world, basically rivaling, sorry, I can't say the word, capitalism, and obviously, so much of the Cold War, I mean, that was a big part of it, right? These two ideas clashing, and then kind of, like, I feel like the fall of the Soviet Union, kind of, I mean, not to say communism doesn't exist anymore as, like, an idea, and I also think there are maybe, perhaps? I mean, I could be wrong, I don't know. But I know it's not completely gone, but, like, it doesn't feel probably as prevalent as it did back in the 20th century, right? So, I don't know, it's just an interesting... Because when we were learning in school, the idea of communism was, like, everyone's equal, um, and everyone... kind of this, like, idea of just what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry, I lack eloquence, unfortunately. But everyone's equal, and I think in some places they took that to the extreme in trying to like, no one owns property, no religion, no, everyone is equal, everyone does the same thing. I think some points everyone owns the same property, and I feel like in practice it never fully was effective, at least in terms of, like, the original way that it's kind of pitched, I feel. I don't know. I find it such an interesting, like, thing that I felt like could never fully be achieved. And, I've heard some debate on, like, the full way that some communism described. A lot of the key traits I've heard or read in terms of achieving it are, like, basically like a moneyless, classless, stateless society around, like, the workers, and kind of like getting rid of a ball of like private property. Something that resonated with me back in sophomore year when I was kind of learning about this stuff that I still think about is that I can't remember if it was in China or some other communist state, but yeah, they tried to do away with private property so anyone could just take whatever they wanted, or something like that. And and, like, I remember right here being like, imagine you just don't own anything and, like, someone could just take your car. It's technically not even your car, it's everyone's car, or something like that. I think they tried to explain it. I just remember thinking, like, oh my goodness. But I feel like, definitely, it's the stateless or idea, like, you can be removed or get rid of the government because it won't be needed, or at least that was, like, an ideal that, or at least one of the ideals that some definition of communism tried to instill, which never happened. I feel like no communist state ever, well, I could be wrong, maybe there is one, but I feel like I've never heard of a communist state that got rid of the government, because there's always a government, there's always something enforcing it. So, I don't know. There's a lot to talk about with this, so I'll stop, but, like, it's just something that I'm trying to, like, fully, like, remember, because like I said, I haven't touched on this subject in, like, 10 years. But, yeah, I'm just trying to remember everything.
Ho Chi Minh chaired the first meeting of what would become the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, or ICP, in 1930, with the express goal of ending colonial rule of his native country. But for all of his early efforts, regime change in Vietnam would not originate with the Vietnamese, but would instead be instigated from the most unlikely of sources: Imperial Japan. In 1940, Japan invaded Vietnam as part of their efforts to establish the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, or in other words, a series of client states under imperial domination. In 1945, they officially annexed the country and expelled all Western influences, including the entire French colonial administration.
Okay, very interesting. That makes sense that the Japanese worked with the puppet French government in a sense, because, well, there was a puppet French government established.
Mere months later, the Japanese surrendered to the Allies, and with their collapse, Vietnam's century-old political order had come crashing down, leaving total chaos in its wake. It was during this last chaotic year of the occupation that Ho Chi Minh truly came into his own as leader. He had returned to Vietnam in 1941 to organize a major resistance movement against Japanese forces known as the Viet Minh, and by 1945 he was leading an army of at least 10,000 communist guerrillas. His long-awaited revolution began on August 15th, before even the ink on the Japanese instrument of surrender had time to dry. With the French colonial forces in Vietnam having been disarmed by the Japanese earlier that year, there was a brief window in time where the Viet Minh had free run of the entire country. But far from screaming defiance at the hated Western imperialists, Ho Chi Minh was instead positively desperate to secure a friendship with the United States. This was due in large part to the activities of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, which had made contact with the Viet Minh in 1945 and selected Ho Chi Minh as their primary contact within Vietnam. Part of what enabled the close relationship between America and the Viet Minh was their lack of a traditional communist agenda. Despite Ho Chi Minh's unabashed belief in the ideology, his primary goal was always the liberation of Vietnam. As he himself stated, at first patriotism, not yet communism.
Oh.
As a result, both Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong initially distrusted Ho Chi Minh for his unwillingness to make class warfare a priority above national freedom. This, however, struck a chord with American observers, who were naturally sympathetic to the idea of an oppressed nation throwing off the shackles of a domineering imperialist regime. Thus, OSS operatives celebrated alongside the peasantry when Ho Chi Minh declared the
This is very interesting. Like in school, when I was back in high school, we kind of get to the main meat of the war already, and it's usually like, oh, America wants to combat, capitalism, and they did it with kind of like with the Korean War, for instance, North versus South, communism versus capitalism, and kind of the same idea was kind of applied to the Vietnam War, kind of like that. And then we kind of just get to it and, read about some of the novels around this time. But it's cool to see like the context of, Ho Chi Minh. Like I mean, I've heard of the guy, obviously, he was mentioned, but like we never really went into in depth of his origin story, as it were. And, his earlier friendliness towards America. So this is very interesting.
Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2nd, 1945. In his opening speech, he began with words familiar to every American.
All men are created equal. Wow. Wow, he quoted that.
Behind him on the podium stood OSS Major Archimedes Patty, and as the speech came to a close, a plane bearing US markings flew over the assembled crowd, which greeted its appearance with thunderous applause. All across the nation, Americans were seen as heroes and liberators, and for a moment, it seemed as if this would be the start of a glorious new relationship between East and West. Of course, we all know that this was never really an option. The French wanted their colonies back, and the newly elected President Truman had no interest in cooperating with an openly communist regime. After negotiations with the French broke down completely, the Vietnamese had no choice but to fight for their independence, and the First Indochina War began on December 16, 1946. During this time, the Nguyen dynasty attempted to reassert its control over the nation, with the 13th emperor, Bao Dai, siding with the French and resuming his place as a puppet ruler over their occupied territories. As the war dragged on, the US began sending aid to the French, but after their dramatic defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, they agreed to new negotiations with the Viet Minh. The ensuing treaty split the country in two halves, the DRV in the north and the State of Vietnam in the south. Bao Dai was then unceremoniously ousted by his prime minister, Ngo Dien Diem, after a referendum determined that the state of Vietnam should become a republic. However, this was hardly a triumph of democracy over imperialism, for Diem was utterly corrupt, and the referendum was blatantly rigged. Diem even went so far as to deliberately ignore the French promise that the South would be allowed to vote on whether or not to reunite with the North under the DRV. When it became obvious that the Diem had no intention of allowing reunification, DRV-backed insurgents began popping up all over the South, causing him to become even more anti-communist, and in turn causing America to offer increasing amounts of aid to his administration. However, Diem proved to be a fickle ally, often refusing to cooperate with his US backers, especially in regards to rural development and land management. In 1963, tensions finally came to a head when Diem was abruptly assassinated in a military coup d'etat that was aided by the CIA. This, combined with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, paved the way for a full-scale US invasion. From the outset of war, Vietnamese generals knew that a conventional victory was impossible. America was simply too powerful to defeat using traditional battlefield tactics. But the huge rural population of the South was already mostly under the sway of the DRV-backed National Liberation Front. Or more commonly known as the Viet Cong, or VC.
Yeah. The Viet Cong. And I'm really happy to be learning about this again, because a lot of names and a lot of ideas are definitely popping up back in my head, and yeah.
In combination with the People's Army of Vietnam, waged a successful series of campaigns against the disorganized South Vietnamese until large numbers of American troops began arriving in 1965. Following American involvement, the conflict began to shift into a war of attrition. Vietnamese defense strategy revolved around their extensive network of tunnels, which many likened more to underground cities than mere military strongholds. Over 200 miles, or 321 kilometers of tunnel were dug during the war, with the largest system at Cu Che being just 20 miles or 32 kilometers out.
Dang, that is cool. Yeah, we've heard obviously of the guerrilla warfare. There's a reason that whenever guerrilla warfare is brought up in places, that it's usually compared to this war, the Vietnam War. Like, for instance, the Peninsula War during the Napoleonic Wars. People have dubbed it Napoleon's Vietnam. And again, like, Vietnam is kind of, especially this war, is synonymous with the idea of guerrilla warfare. Usually when you hear about it, I feel like this war can be like one of the first things that pop up. And like you obviously heard of like sneak attacks, ambushes at night. I think even sometimes civilians being involved, and like the US soldiers being very like paranoid because they didn't know who could be potentially enemy or foe. And there's the idea, like there's a famous saying, like, or like when the or there are memes about it. There's memes about everything, but like when the trees start talking, and then or they're in the trees, like yelling at that because they would just pop up anywhere and attack you. And yes, this is one of the traps I remember hearing extensively about. That like sometimes soldiers would fall and be like pierced by these wooden spikes, and then I heard sometimes, like, I could be wrong, but I could have sworn I remember hearing that sometimes they would cover them with like poop or something, so they would get diseased and like afflicted quicker, something like that. But yeah, I've heard of these traps obviously, but I didn't know they basically built entire elaborate. I guess these look like underground cities, places to sleep and stuff. Like, wow, like basically like very intricate tunnels that they built. No wonder they could pop up and out of nowhere at times very quickly. Dang, dude.
Saigon. Their importance was summed up in the words of Colonel Chow Lam. We knew the Americans were determined to find and destroy the tunnel system. They understood, as did we, however Ku Che went, so did the war. It was our determination not to lose even 1 centimeter of the tunnels. It was a contest of wills, resulting in some very fierce fighting. We made a tremendous sacrifice to gain victory. 2 years after its arrival, the United States of America expanded its bombing campaigns across North Vietnam in an effort to break their will to fight. When a North Vietnamese civilian saw the first B-57 bombers open their bomb bays over his home province of Quang Minh, his first thought was not to flee in panic, but was instead, why is a mother airplane dropping baby airplanes? Having miraculously survived the initial attack, he gathered his family and fled for the nearby caves. He later recalled to a journalist, "People didn't talk about the meaning of the war. We were really confused why the Americans tried to invade our homeland. We hadn't done anything to them." Sadly, the citizens of Vietnam had much more to fear than American bombs. When Viet Cong guerrillas went to ground among the rural peasantry, US forces responded by declaring any villages with a suspected VC presence as free fire zones.
Yeah, no doubt, as with any war, a lot of regular people who had nothing to do with that suffered. And obviously that's kind of the point. You could imagine with the paranoia, it's like at times you didn't know who was on your side. Like I remember hearing like certain US soldiers wouldn't know who was like a Viet Cong or not. And obviously with that paranoia, and if you have like some less reserved people in the army, this led to obviously a lot of suffering, and a lot of innocent Vietnamese people suffered. But it's awful, by the way, but it's sadly a trend in war that a lot of innocent people who were just trying to mind their own business suffered. And as with any war, I think that's kind of the thing with both sides of war. Both armies of any war are going to commit, atrocities or war crimes. Like, heard of like US soldiers raping Vietnamese women and stuff. Like after watching so many war videos, you come to realize that all sides in every war, winners, losers, there are soldiers and people who just do bad things, and at the end it's always a common trend that just regular innocent people die and suffer and are killed who didn't deserve it, but unfortunately do, because as the saying goes, war is, it never changes, and it's sad, you know. Um, Obviously on both sides, not every soldier is evil though. Like, I think that's kind of a big thing when in America there was a lot of protesting at the time. You can even look at, videos of like US citizens protesting the war. Though obviously when a lot of US veterans from the war returned, a lot weren't treated so well. You can read a lot of accounts of, veterans from Vietnam being called stuff like baby killers and, not treated as gloriously as like the veterans from, say, World War II or not. And definitely, that didn't help. And not every US soldier was evil, but there definitely were, as there are any sides, some people who just do awful things. I think that's kind of like just something in war that I've come to realize, and definitely it's not all black and white, you know. Um yeah, it's tragic. It's the tragic reality of war. That's why no matter what, it's always a tragedy. War is always awful. So, yeah.
Then came the infamous My Lai massacre on March 16, 1968, when at least 347 unarmed civilians were brutally executed by American soldiers. Although the heroic actions of a US helicopter crew saved a few innocent lives, most were not so fortunate, and My Lai would go on to become known as the worst war crime ever perpetrated by US soldiers in Vietnam. As traumatizing as the war was for the civilian population, it was arguably just as bad for the Vietnamese soldiers on account of how long most were expected to serve on the front lines. Lê Cao Dai, head of surgery at a military hospital, later recalled, "When we were called to go south, everyone was very excited. As it turned out, while I only planned to stay for 6 months, I ended up staying for 8 years.
Dang.
Given these extended deployment times, Vietnamese soldiers quickly became hardened to the horrors of war and had little mercy for any Americans unfortunate enough to fall into their grasp. American pilots were especially loathed due to their indiscriminate bombing campaigns, and many were tortured to death after they bailed out over Vietnamese territory. To keep their populace motivated and stave off the effects of war weariness, the DRV maintained strong and effective propaganda campaigns throughout the conflict. The mastermind behind these campaigns was Vo Nguyen Giap, a renowned military leader who had fought alongside Ho Chi Minh since the 1940s. People quickly formed long queues to purchase his newspapers and listen to loudspeaker broadcasts about the latest developments on the front lines. With minimal access to international news, the people of the North were easily swayed by party rhetoric, and quickly came to regard the war as a necessary and righteous struggle against yet another imperialist aggressor. By contrast, the urban population of the South could listen to foreign news reports and had a much more conflicted attitude towards the violence tearing apart their nation. The success of the Vietnamese propaganda machine was demonstrated following the Tet Offensive of 1968, which caught US forces completely by surprise. Amidst the chaos, VC infiltrators launched an attack on the American embassy in Saigon, penetrating the compound and opening fire on the Chancery building with rocket-propelled grenades. Although the building withstood the assault, the fact that such an attack had occurred at all was psychologically devastating to the USA, proving that not even the capital city of South Vietnam was safe from communist infiltration.
Oh, wow.
The Tet Offensive also brought the reality of war to the urban population of the South, leading many to lose confidence in the Western-backed government. By the early 1970s, the endless jungle warfare had taken their toll on both sides. But the DRV remained defiant, while US morale had plummeted to the point where soldiers were openly ignoring orders and deserting in record numbers. Desperate to at least preserve the status quo, America began pouring resources into strengthening the South Vietnamese army while pulling out its own traumatized troops out of the conflict. But it was too little, too late, and in 1975, a massive offensive by the DRV known as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign smashed through the defenses around Saigon and decapitated the Republic. After almost 20 years of war and millions of deaths, the DRV finally stood triumphant. Against all odds, communism had won. Or had it? While the sacrifices made by the North Vietnamese during the war allowed them to survive and eventually reunite with the South, the conflict would leave millions on both sides scarred for life. Furthermore, despite the expectations of the international community, communism failed to spread throughout Southeast Asia after the fall of Saigon, rendering decades of US obsession with the domino theory utterly pointless. Despite the repeated entries of Ho Chi Minh and extensive testimonies.
Yeah, there are some critics. Again, I can't speak for every American. I'm only speaking kind of like what I've heard and kind of like around my area. I don't want to act like, when I say something that all Americans believe this, because it is, I think with most places, there are many people with many different opinions, especially about this war. Though I feel like you'll hear a lot more negative than positive, at least when discourse kind of pops up around this. But yeah, some people are I've heard criticize the idea of combating communism and waging these like proxy wars. Like for this example, like maybe America shouldn't have done that. There are some people I've heard like criticize that maybe America should have just left better off alone for its own sake, but then there are a lot of people you'll hear at the same time be like, no, America should have, and they, it was right at the end. Yeah, definitely it is I feel like it is a topic of debate, because I have come across like forums and stuff on history. As you guys know, I love going around history forums and kind of reading what people think about certain subjects, and yeah, this is a topic that does inspire the debate, regardless of like, was America right to do this in the long run, or did we just get a bunch of people killed for for gains that, communism wouldn't have flourished as kind of it didn't, so maybe we shouldn't have been so aggressive. Again, it is something debatable, and I've read both sides. I don't really have a clear stance in terms of like, I think, yeah, America should have combated, or like America shouldn't have done nothing. Like, you get me? I can't pretend that I have a clear, strong stance on either side, but I've heard both sides, read some things that some people say with arguments for both, and I think this is definitely one of those chapters in American history where at least a lot I've read, people are like, yeah, Vietnam was a disaster. This instance of America was not America's greatest moment. And yeah, I'm interested. What do you guys think about the Vietnam War? I know that I'm very fortunate that a lot of people who do comment on my videos aren't from America. Usually some of you are from around the world, so I'm wondering what you all think about this, like an outside American perspective of those of you who heard and learned about this, because I'm really interested. I really do want to know what people from other nations and countries outside of America think of all this, think of the Cold War, think of, this whole battle of ideology and these proxy wars that the two superpowers waged. I'm really interested. Please feel free to comment and let me know. Like, I would love to read.
By OSS operatives in the 1940s, America never fully grasped that it was the desire for liberty, not communism, that motivated the North Vietnamese to fight on against the odds. Their support of the corrupt Diem administration only furthered this rift in understanding, and the resultant 2 decades of violence opened up a deep national wound between North and South that has yet to be fully healed.
I'm interested. Wait, let me look at something. Okay, sorry, I'm just looking at a map. Apparently, according to some quick Google searching, it still... Does it still identify as communist? That's what it says, a quick Google search. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam is an authoritarian state ruled by a single party, the Communist Party of Vietnam. So they might still just go with, or still go under the label. And I think China also, like, still is referred to as a communist state, state. So I don't know, but point is, it's interesting to see the long-term ramifications of this war. And again, I really want to, I'm happy to look at this video and get a reminder, because like I said, I haven't touched on this topic for like 10 years. So I'm interested in knowing what anyone else thinks of this whole era and the Cold War. Feel free to comment, and I'll be reading. Hopefully I'll be reading. So yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow when we start something new.